Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the Buckley Institute's annual conference. And thanks especially for coming to our third panel of the day, which is entitled The Party of Buckley No More, Fusionism, Fractures, and the Conservatism of the Future. And we're very lucky to have three highly distinguished panelists joining us today for a conversation on fusionism. And I'll give quick introductions for all of them. The structure of this panel is the same as the structure of our other panels. We'll start off with 35, 40 minutes of conversation between the three panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So without further ado, let me present our guests. Eugene B. Meyer is currently a senior advisor to the Dean of the University of Florida Law School. Before that, for 42 years, he was president and CEO of the Federalist Society and has served as executive director, CEO, and/or president of the organization. He's responsible for shepherding the organization from a small group of law students to a community of 90,000 lawyers, law students, academics, judges, and others interested in the rule of law. The Society now includes a student chapter at nearly every ABA-accredited law school in the country, and lawyers' chapters in 220 major cities across the nation. Gene earned his BA in history at Yale in 1975 and his MA in political science from the London School of Economics in 1976. Mr. Meyer currently serves on the boards of the Holman Foundation and the Sarah Scafie Foundation. He also holds the title of International Chess Master. Mr. Stephen F. Hayward is the Edward Gaylor Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and a Fellow of the Public Law and Policy Program at UC Berkeley School of Law. From 2002 to 2012, he was the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and has been a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco since 1991. Dr. Hayward writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New York Post, Washington Post, National Review, the Claremont Review of Books, and other publications. The author of 10 books, including a 2-volume chronicle of Ronald Reagan and his times, and other books, such as The Almanac of Environmental Trends and Patriotism is Not Enough, Henry Jaffa, Walter Burns, and the Arguments that Redefined American Conservatism. His most recent book is M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit, Apostle of Freedom. He writes almost daily at the Political Questions Substack. Finally, Mr. Matthew Continetti is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and the inaugural Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work is focused on American political thought and history, with a particular focus on the development of the Republican Party and the American conservative movement in the 20th century. Mr. Continetti is also a columnist at the Free Press, contributing editor at National Review, and a columnist for Commentary magazine. He has been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post, among other outlets. His broadcast appearances include Fox News Channel's Special Report with Bret Baier and NBC News' Meet the Press. Mr. Continetti is the author of 3 books, including, most recently, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. Please join me in welcoming our guests. So the subject of our panel today is fusionism within American conservatism. And I think we'll deal with questions of history and the past as well. But I'd love to start by asking you all about fusionism as you see it today and how it relates to the fusionism of the past. So how would you characterize the major divides and alliances within American conservatism? And please, you're welcome to share any other initial thoughts about the panel topic as well. Well, Mr. Meyer.
Well, thank you, Jack. And first, I want to thank the Buckley Institute, not only for this conference, but for the great work it's done. As a Yale grad, I am thrilled to see how well it has done in what it's doing. I did not think it would have anywhere near the success it has had. Thanks to Lauren Noble and all the people at Buckley Institute for that. I did. This sort of goes to the last panel, but I met Bill Buckley briefly a few times, but one of the times was, or a couple of times, was when he was helping. He came up to Woodstock to meet with my father, and he'd bring chocolate cigarettes to for me as a kid. and which was very nice, but unfortunately it did lead to a lifelong addiction to chocolate. Anyway, I want to start out with just a couple things on fusionism, because I think there is sometimes some real misunderstanding of, oh, was a great way to fight communism and bring disparate people together. But that's that's really not the war right now, and it's not all that relevant. And fusionism was never that. It was a side aspect of it. Fusionism specifically, and I should say the term was originally used derisively. It was not my father's term. It was used to attack it, but it's become the term to be used. So I will use it. But it is the basic idea is that the Western civilization, Judeo-Christian ethic, have two great principles or ideas: the importance of freedom and the importance of virtue. And there can be tension between those two, but as with any great truths, they're not in direct conflict. The aspect of fusionism that's sort of striking is both those parts are very important to each other. Freedom doesn't do very well in society without virtue, and virtue doesn't do very well in society without freedom. And one other thing I'd say is the freedom part is what we achieve through public policy, direct battles. The virtue part is more achieved through intermediate institutions. The whole idea of fusionism is based on seeing the Constitution as the best embodiment the American Constitution is the best embodiment in practice of the traditions of Western civilization and the Judeo-Christian ethic, which are a part of really probably have foundations of basically in natural law. So that's what the idea is. And it is not something which is going to give a direct answer to most of the political questions we have. It is rather a structure for how to think about what the correct answers will be. So it's not going to tell you what the tax rate should be or exactly what type of programs are okay. It's going to tell you want to end up with a free and virtuous society so the citizens in that society can flourish. And to the extent that is true, it was true yesterday, it's true today, and it will be true tomorrow. In addressing the various problems you talked about, and I'll let others address them a bit more, but in addressing the various problems you talked about, fusionism is a way to think about them and a way to get to good solutions and good ideas, and good practical approaches. So it doesn't solve everything, but it is very, very important to how you think about things. And the final thing I'll close with, and we can get into this more later, it is probably more important than ever today, given a lot of the questions and challenges we have within the conservative movement, because you have to understand the importance of both freedom and virtue. And once again, without both, it's hard to have a good and flourishing society.
Well, thank you. And I'll echo Gene in thanking the Buckley Institute for keeping alive the legacy of Buckley I'll give two reasons for this. One is I wrote some months ago rather cheekily that I think Buckley is the most consequential political journalist in American history, full stop. And people sort of poo-poo that, but my point is I think he deserves to be remembered alongside Mark Twain in American letters. And that means keep his memory alive. But then part two is there's a lot of shade. Well, we've already thrown a lot of shade on previous panels at the youngsters today, the kids. I'm old enough now I can do that. I always wanted to be a kid forever. And they're all, they're down on Reagan. Zombie Reaganism is a phrase we hear, and who's Buckley? We don't care about him. But you don't have to pick on the kids. Yesterday, I was astonished to see an acquaintance of mine, Adrian Vermeule of Harvard Law School, interesting guy, the author of Common Good Constitutionalism, which is very popular with certain parts of the right these days. A person, by the way, who's very shy about debating anyone who disagrees with him. I think I may be the only person who conned him into a debate, and I had to do it in Milan, Italy. It's a funny story about that, and I like the guy personally, but yesterday he tweeted out, "I don't care what Buckley has to say about anything." And that's who some of the young kids are taking their cues from. So this aggrieves me greatly. My contribution here, and I feel a little bashful because I'm going to talk a bit about Eugene's dad and a synoptic history of the right next to the most capacious recent historian of the right. So like James Stockdale, why am I here? But in my, you remember this, right? Okay, right. So in my lifetime, my own lifetime, there have been 3 or 4 new rights arriving on the scene. If you do the history, I think you take it back to right after World War II. And New Right, it was often called this in the media, New Right 1.0. I think right now today we're New Right 4.5. I'll go through the progression very quickly. You could be New Right 6.0 depending on how you want to do those numbers, but it's this, you'll see the categories. The initial New Right was, and what set off Eugene's dad, in one of his earliest essays from 1955, Collectivism Rebaptized, was the conservatives like Peter Vierek and Clinton Rossiter, even Walter Lippmann to a small extent, and their view was, conservatism ought to be embracing the New Deal, embracing labor unions and economic planning, and accept without reservation coexistence with communism. And as Frank Meyer put it, nothing that Adlai Stevenson or Arthur Schlesinger would object to. Well, this wouldn't do for Frank Meyer and a lot of other conservatives. But before getting into his construction that came to be known as Fusionism, he did take a detour to talk about the one big figure who was a rival to those guys, which was Russell Kirk. And he treated him respectfully, but did summarize it as Dawnish speculation, although I always thought the better brief critique, was Whittaker Chambers' famous letter to Buckley, where he said, "We must give Kirk an A for effort, but would you charge the machine gun nests in the South Pacific for that conservative position? And neither would I." That's how the letter went, right? You know this one. So that gives us New Right, and it was then called the New Right, of Buckley and National Review, and a conservatism that said to Eisenhower, he's not interested in rollback of the New Deal, and he's not interested in the rollback of communism, and we want both of those things, right? Then you got to fast forward about 20 years to the New Right of the 70s, which was the social and religious conservatives, what crystallized as the majority, moral majority, and so forth. And about the same time, so that's New Right 3.0, if you're following the numbers. At that time, you also have the emergence of the neoconservatives. I call them New Right 3.5. They were also reacting to some of the radical changes of the 60s, but on a different ground. It wasn't religious, it was social science. Oh, most people know that story. And then here 10, 12 years ago, New Right 4.0 emerges, and it's the nationalism, populism that we're all very familiar with. And here in the last 2 weeks, we become conscious of the New Right 4.5, which is the shorthand phrase is we're calling it Groyperism, or Groypers, right? It's, okay, most of you, I'm sure, are at least dimly aware of what's going on and all the controversies around it. I won't say I don't quite understand it, but I don't want to waste much time getting into it. So here's the point, is Meyer, and then of course the whole National Review set, of which he was such an important part of, said actually there's a unity, I sort of restate Fusionism this way, there's a unity between what we call traditional conservatism and free market capitalism. And one of his key principles, I can almost quote it, was the economic sphere should be as free as a political control as possible. And so on, just to pick on one group today, then I'll stop, is, a lot of my friends in the national conservative movement, some of them are people I know very well and respect and like, and I'm intrigued by, but they're saying, we ought to like labor unions again. Even though, organized labor was 30% of the American workforce in the 50s, and now the private sector is maybe 4%. Okay, doesn't sound very promising, but also industrial policy. I keep raising my hand saying, when did Walter Mondale become a Republican? I mean, people are proposing the things Walter Mondale proposed in 1984, and we called him a socialist central planner. And I'm open to these ideas that we ought to have a political economy that distributes wealth more widely, that favors the working classes and so forth. I'm absolutely in full sympathy with that. I'm waiting for details because I keep saying, how are you going to pull it off, and please be specific. I don't get very far. And so what I think is in a certain way, what I've called nationalism, populism 4.0 is really a throwback to Do Right 1.0. It's Viereck and Rossiter and the others. And so I think, in my last opening thought is, the old fusionism may become new again.
Well, thank you all for coming here, and it's a pleasure to be with my fellow panelists and with you all. I'm probably the last generation of conservative to have met William F. Buckley, Jr. He died in 2008. I met him as an undergraduate in my senior year at Columbia. I had a job at National Review, which was really my excuse for not studying my senior year. And I was invited to one of those editorial dinners that was discussed in the last panel. And everything that Larry Perlman and Charles Kessler and Catherine Jean Lopez were saying about Buckley's humanity and gift for friendship was absolutely the case. He had no reason to be courteous to this 21-year-old senior at Columbia who he had never met, but he insisted that I be seated next to him at cocktail hour and at the dinner. He turned to me for my perspective on the state of the American economy in the fall of 2002, at a table featuring Larry Lindsey, who was then President Bush's chief economic advisor, and Larry Kudlow, the former assistant secretary of the Treasury, and a longtime friend now. That was the night I met him. It was a wonderful evening. There was one postscript, though, which is that Buckley spent the entire evening calling me Paul. Buckley was not the best with names, as those of you who knew him might recall. But so I've always thought that I was somehow misnamed, and people have two names. My official name is Matthew Continetti, but for those in the know, you can call me Paul. I also thought it was somewhat ironic, for as heroic a figure as William F. Buckley, Jr., kind of as influential as Stephen Hayward says, when the very sharp question from the undergraduate came in the previous panel about how can we revive his legacy, the answer was, look up clips of Firing Line on YouTube. And I thought it's funny that the two main ways that Buckley is now remembered, through Firing Line and a commemorative stamp, are both projects of the federal government. Firing Line appeared on the public broadcasting system, and the post office, as I recall, Frank Meyer was not the biggest fan of zip codes as well. So these are the ironies of history. Just briefly on fusionism. I think what Eugene Meyer was saying is absolutely the case. When Frank Meyer began conceptualizing, articulating what American conservatism was, he was being descriptive, not prescriptive. He was describing what he saw as a participant in this burgeoning conservative movement. And the conservatives that he saw and that he interacted with, the conservative intellectuals he was discoursing with, could achieve this balance, or sought to achieve a balance between freedom and virtue, between liberty and tradition. Moreover, they could do so only in the context of American conservatism. So it was extremely American conservatism that this movement was based on. Frank Meyer's political theory was grounded in an appreciation for the exceptional nature of the United States Constitution. So that Constitution created a political order in which freedom was the highest political value, but we were granted the social space where we could pursue virtue as the highest human value. And so he distinguished between the political and the human. Of course, one of the big fights we're having today is with individuals and figures who want to collapse the two, right? But he understood America as creating this political space where under this shelter of freedom we could pursue virtue in our own way. Right? So this is the exceptional nature of this exceptionally American conservatism. There was one other aspect of it that's important, and that even as he's defining conservatism in the pages of National Review, and as a historian, I've realized the dangers of historical thinking. He's defining a permanent position. Russell Kirk, who was just mentioned by Stephen Hayward, talked about the permanent things. Conservatives stand for these timeless principles. And in the case of Fusionism, or the mainstream American conservatism that Meyer and National Review argued for, that Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan championed in the political sphere, the idea of the balance between freedom and order is a permanent idea. What might change is which side of that balance we emphasize. So that in the 1950s and early 1960s, when we lived in the time of the organization man, these huge corporate structures, big government, freedom was what was leaned on. Right? But by the end of the 60s, when Meyer and National Review are encountering the student revolt, the riots, the rise in crime, you see a more concerted emphasis on the order, not to the abandonment of freedom, just to say that in these political circumstances, we need to emphasize this side. And I feel that today we are presented with this demand that we choose one or the other. And in doing so, we are taken away from that Americanness which should inform conservatism. One final aspect. As we're thinking through what Fusionism is, what conservatism means, there was also the importance of guardrails. Because these principles were timeless, it meant that those who didn't agree with the principles were just not part of this conservative mainstream. And eventually you had to choose, right? You had to fish or cut bait. You had to decide. And so, as we know, one of National Review's projects was to say that conspiracy theorists were not part of this conservatism, that anti-Semites were not part of this conservatism, that kooks were not part of this conservatism. All right? Not just because the viability of the movement depended on the ability for us to present arguments that would be granted the slightest bit of legitimacy by the left and by liberals, but also because those tendencies reject the principles at the heart of this American conservatism. And so I think that we've returned, to answer your question, Jack, we've returned to that moment where we have to reassert guardrails. We have to say, look, these are the principles. They're timeless. If you don't agree with them, then you're not conservative. And go on your merry way. Right? And very similar to the situation that confronted liberals, as we understand it, in the 1950s and 60s, when they were confronted by radicals of the New Left. And many of these liberals had been radicals in their youth in the 1930s. And here suddenly they're middle-aged people, they're professors, they're well established, And they're confronted by young people who are voicing the same arguments for radical change, for the radical uprooting of the American experiment. And one of them, Nat Glazer, a professor, recalled that he had been so long since he had heard the questions coming from young people that he had forgotten the answers to them. And so he put it, as he put it in the title of one of his collections in the 1960s, it was the job of people like him to remember the answers. And I think now it's the time for conservatives to remember the answers, and by doing so, define American conservative thought in the same way that the iconic figures of the movement did in the past, in ways that are still true today and will be true henceforth.
Yeah, thank you all for these opening comments. I think this provides a really excellent grounding, especially Professor Hayward's historical context that he provided, and Mr. Continetti and Mr. Meyer's discussion of principles and what makes conservatism what it is. I wonder if we could turn our discussion now to our current political moment, and I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on this, and particularly get your thoughts on, if I was following Professor Hayward, what you called the Fusionism 4.0, I think.
Well, it'd be 5.0. But
5.0.
Right.
Yeah. And if you could talk about this coalition that elected Donald Trump in 2024, to what extent is it a unified coalition? To what extent is it a new fusionism? What are the big divides within this coalition? What holds it together apart from Trump itself? And what do you think is its future? And this is a very big question, but Mr. Continetti, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. So I think that right now we're beginning to have an argument about what the MAGA movement is. During the debate over Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike on the Iranian nuclear program, President Trump was under a lot of criticism by what I'll call MAGA influencers, podcasters, social media personalities, figures like Tucker Carlson, who were saying that Operation Midnight Hammer, if it became a reality, would cause World War III, and hundreds of thousands of Americans would be dead within months. And Trump was very frustrated with these critiques and said, I define what MAGA is. I define what MAGA is. Not kooky Tucker Carlson. His words. I think right now we're seeing a challenge about whether that's the case or not. And I think it's a consequence of the fact that when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, he was not the outcome or result of a movement. He created the movement. So we can think about this in terms of the conservative movement. It would be as though Barry Goldwater won in 1964. 6 years after, or 9 years after National Review is launched. The conservative movement was just getting started. Suddenly they're presented with this tremendous victory. One of their own has won the Republican nomination. And William F. Buckley Jr. says in the speech before Goldwater loses to the Young Americans for Freedom, he says, I'm not sure we're actually prepared for this. We're not ready quite for this. If we were to win, which he didn't think Goldwater would win at that point, what would we do, right? Trump comes in 2015, he overturns the settled nature of things. He inspires a lot of critics of conservatism, longstanding critics of conservatism, to kind of attach themselves to him because he's creating the space for their views to go forth. But I don't think anyone was as surprised that he won as he was. For those of you who were up on election night 2016, when CNN called the election for Trump, and they cut to Trump at the celebration, and the look on his face, it was one of the few times I've ever seen him kind of, I want to call it nervous, but it was kind of, he gets that expression where he's processing information. I actually love that expression when he does it. That was one of the moments when I saw it. It was, and so here you are, you're confronted. What is MAGA? What is this? What is going to happen? And we know what happened. What happened was in the first term, Trump relied on the conservative movement. He relied on the Federalist Society and changed the Supreme Court and changed the world. Right? He relied on the Republicans in Congress who wrote the Trump tax cut. Right? He relied on parts of the kind of conservative national security world who were tough on Iran, who wanted to be tough on China. And he added his own flavor to all of this. There's no question, especially with China, where the idea of decoupling, or what we call it now, deconflicting, right? That was new. But he still had some ties, some connections. The second term is very different. Now it's all Trump. Now the whole party has changed to adopt MAGA. But what it's done is it creates this moment where, as Trump nears the end of his presidency, the question is what comes next? And can you have a MAGA movement without Donald Trump? And if you can have that, what is that? Is it just warmed over Buchananism? Or is it a potential return to fusionism? Or is it some fusionism modified in the light of the understanding of contemporary reality that Donald Trump kind of forced upon us beginning in 2015? That's the question, and I think it will be some time before we have an answer to it.
I hate playing political pundit and political analyst, because first of all, I'm not very good at it. I've been, especially about the future, I've been wrong about everything the last 10 years. But a couple of thoughts. I guess when you said Paul, I'm going to call you Paul.
My true name.
Right. By the way, you said working in National Review was an excuse to not study. Mine in college was reading National Review was my excuse for not studying. So you didn't just, okay. You said that Trump created the MAGA movement, and I guess that's right, although I do think it is right. But it would not have succeeded if you hadn't had the substrate. So one of the things about nationalism, which I didn't really see coming, but it's a global phenomenon, right? I mean, the Brexit vote preceded Trump, and you're seeing very similar expressions of popular disgust with our governing institutions throughout all of Europe. And so that's a real thing happening. And Trump tapped into that and accelerated. I think that's true. The other thing, if you just look at the last several elections, and they've all been close, right? And I've always resisted monistic explanations for anything, but this whole 10-year period, I think it really applies. So, the last election, people are concerned about inflation. That always works for Republicans, right? What Michael Barone said 40 years ago, there's nothing wrong with the Republicans that 10% inflation won't cure. And nothing when Democrats are down, nothing that 10% unemployment won't cure for Democrats, right? So there's that, but there's also, what we group together as wokery. Certainly that helped Glenn Youngkin in the Virginia election 4 years ago. Not so much this year in Virginia. Some of these you may say are niche issues, and we can differ on the scope of them and how wide they are, but in a 50-50 nation, every little increment makes the difference in this closely divided political world we have. Now, I think what comes after Trump, this may sound ridiculous, and I'll qualify it immediately. I try to think of any political figure I could think of in sort of the last 200 years that Trump can be compared to. And the best I could do is Charles de Gaulle. Now, huge differences between them. De Gaulle was a real intellectual. That's not Trump. No one would ever confuse the edge of the sword with the art of the deal. But they do have these similarities, sort of personal and political. One is de Gaulle was a very great man who could be an absolutely awful and horrid human being with an absolutely outsized ego that could offend everybody and did offend everybody. I mean, I forget, it was Churchill or Roosevelt said, I have an extra cross to bear, his name's Charles de Gaulle. And he was the start of a big political movement, and he was France, right? And that first sentence of his war memoirs, which are great reading, is I've always had a certain idea of France. And, translated for the idiom of a real estate developer from Queens, it sounds similar to the way Trump thinks and talks. But there's really no successor to de Gaulle. In fact, whenever there was a crisis in France for the next 20 years after the war, they brought him back and made him president, and it didn't always go well. And he ended his life thinking he'd failed, by the way. There'd been like a Gaullist party, and, people succeeded him. And he was, by the way, also conservative in certain ways, but like Trump, certainly willing to embrace socialism when it suited his own personal and political needs. And so there's a problem that Trump really does owe a lot of his success not only to exploiting the issue map, but he does have a lot of charisma. Some of that's negative charisma, I grant you that. I keep dusting off my Max Weber when I think about Trump. So there's a few thoughts to throw out there. He could get lucky. I think tariffs are a terrible idea, and he seems to think so too this week, at least for coffee. I don't know how this is all going to work out. My crystal ball was broken, and it was cloudy even when it wasn't. So, as he likes to say, we'll just have to see what happens, and thank you for your attention to this matter.
A couple thoughts. One, I think that a lot of the initial MAGA movement was based on a lot of people who ended up supporting Trump's view was, Republicans, Democrats, whoever it is, all I know is Washington always seems to benefit and I always seem to get screwed. Yeah. And that coalition is still there. There will be some political question of how it's reached. Sometimes, a lot of times they were absolutely right on what was happening, and sometimes I think they were saying, why don't I get some of these goodies that are handed out? And I don't think government should have any of the particular goodies they're talking about, but that was, I think, how they were thinking. The second of the 3 points I wanted to make is the importance of power in all of this, because I'll go back to my freedom and virtue point. The great advantage of freedom as a goal to be achieved through politics and the public policy process is freedom is not primarily about the accumulation of power. All other things of that sort are, including the attempt to encourage virtue. That is why it is so important that freedom be done through the political means and the other things be done through intermediate institutions. And the third thing, which is in terms of how we try to do some of this stuff, isn't just a description of one thing we need to do. There's a line, I've heard this several different people credited for this, but each age needs to find its own language for the eternal truths. I would argue that each age, including ours, needs to find its own language for defending the importance of both freedom and virtue.
Yeah, thank you all for these comments. I'll just ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to you all for Q&A. I think the little blurb in your pamphlets mentions the Tea Party, which was a movement that gained a lot of momentum all at once and then kind of flamed out. And a lot of the elements of sort of fusionism and different conservative coalitions have turned out to be kind of like the Tea Party, in that they gain a lot of momentum and then they flame out. What do you think has been and or will be the most enduring sort of element of conservatism, from the time of Reagan to today and going forward? Like, what do you see as the sort of essential thing that doesn't change? And you don't get extra points for saying Buckleyite conservatism. Mr. Meyer.
I'll say Reagan. No, I'm sort of serious about that. That was the time when both was a successful presidency, but he also pulled together a lot of the ideas that were valid then and are still valid today. And in some form or other, I think we're not going to have Reagan as that person, but we're going to need to have some leadership along those lines, and that leadership if we flourish as a country, is going to need to include a lot of the basic principles we've been talking about. If it doesn't, we either will not end up being successful, or, and this is one of the concerns I have about, there's a lot of talk right now, I hear a lot anyway, about, all this is very well, but we need to win. And if it takes using the power of government to win, we need to use that power to win. There are areas of Trump where I'd have concerns about what he's done in that regard, but it's a general view of a lot of people. And what I would say is, if you take that too far, one, I don't know that it will succeed. But if it does succeed, by the time you've won, you won't be we anymore. You won't be you anymore. It will be something else that has won.
Yeah, so you mentioned that we have the old Oakland Raiders attitude, just win, baby, right? What's some of the oldest formulas in politics is what? Tax, spend, elect, and elect. And these days I'm wondering, wait, is that the other guys or is that us now? Because one thing we haven't mentioned, it was something that was always on the mind of National Review and just about every issue, is fiscal restraint. Anybody? Bueller? Right? I mean, we don't hear anything about this from Capitol Hill Republicans anymore. Any serious talk, let alone planning for fiscal restraint, sadly rode out of town with Paul Ryan, and that's starting to be a while ago now. And occasionally it pops up, but we're worse off than ever in that regard. And that could threaten everything, and Lord only knows what happens if something really goes upside down. Okay, what's the other thought I have on that? I show this to students often the first day of class, depending on what I'm teaching, and it's the Gallup, Pew, old Harris numbers. You stitch these together from the late 50s to now, and it's the question, do you have confidence in the federal government to do the right thing all the time, most of the time, a little bit, none of the time? And the number of, and I put the chart up on PowerPoint, which I usually try to avoid, but you really need to, this is the time when you really use it. If you go back to the late 50s, when Gallup and all the rest started asking that question, it was almost 80% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing all the time or most of the time. Anyone know what that number is today? 20. Yeah, it's about 15%. It's been downhill ever since. The only time, lower, someone said, well, maybe this week, the only time it ever had a sustained reversal was under President Reagan. It never got back up to 80, but it got close to 50 again for most of the 80s, and that's because things seem to get better. In my opinion, they did get better. Okay, and then it resumed downhill again. Seems to me that's a crisis for, it's true in a lot of overseas countries, not all of them, by the way. I've looked at the transnational polls on this, and you see some interesting variations, like India. Their governments get very high approval ratings from their citizens, which I think is interesting. So much corruption there and dysfunction and so forth, but seems to be going in the right direction for most everybody. That's a real crisis, I think, for our institutions, not just public institutions, because you do the same polls for corporate America, banks. They all look pretty bad too. The only people that hold up well is the military. And one reason is our military is still competent, right? They still know how to kill people and break things. That's their job, and they do it well, better than anybody else. All other levels of government these days seem incredibly incompetent. That's not necessarily an ideological point, and by the way, I'm fascinated with the abundance liberals have come along and say, maybe we've overregulated things. And I always raise my hand and say, hello, we've been yelling this for 50 years, and now you figured it out, so they're slow learners, but at least they're learning. And if that's not fixed, and then who knows what the electoral appeals, all the rest of that. I think it just keeps spiraling downward if we don't figure out how to get competent government back. One example, I won't go off on my rant about, I used to be a fairly serious cyclist when I was younger, but the bike lanes are out of control. I won't go off on my full rant about this, except there's a story in the San Francisco Chronicle just a few days ago about a bike lane planned to go alongside the LA River, which if you've been to LA is actually a storm channel that's paved in concrete. So they want to put a bike lane next to it. It's supposed to be done by now. Hasn't started. The environmental review is still underway. And the cost has doubled for a bike lane, $1 billion with a B. I don't care what, really, I mean, people ought to be out with their pitchforks about silliness like this, and I won't start on the train either. In fact, I'll just stop.
I think in one of the earlier panels, the question was asked, how do conservatives compete when cultural institutions, media, are so dominated by liberal perspectives? And my answer would have been a quotation from Lady Thatcher, which is, the facts of life are conservative. Reality wins. And it's just a question of whether you realize that before the disaster happens or after. And unfortunately, I think we're on a trajectory where we're going to have to realize it after the disaster. Your question, though, Jack, was what endures? I think this is a nerd speaking. I think the books will endure. One thing that has made the conservative movement so powerful and effective was that it was a movement of ideas. It was a movement of books. And these books are still available, whether it's in defense of freedom.
I was saying to Gene how fresh this book reads now. This is a book, some of these essays are 70 years old.
Or whether it's Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind, even if you won't charge up the beach at Tarawa for it, it still will have a great influence on a young person in particular. I was one of them. Or Capitalism and Freedom. Or The Constitution of Liberty. These books are not going anywhere. Or Thomas Sowell's Corpus. Right? Basic economics to anything, conquest and cultures. It's only a matter of rediscovering them, and especially finding a way to publicize and communicate their insights to a generation that only lives through this. That is, I think, one of the major challenges facing conservatives today. The work is there, the principles are eternal. It's a matter of finding a way to make them inspire young people.
Yeah, thank you all for these thoughts. We'll turn to audience Q&A now in our remaining 10 plus minutes.
Hi, Jack Fowler. I used to be the publisher of National Review, and two things. One, Steve, when Bill Buckley ran for mayor in 1965, he did want bike lanes in New York City. I just thought you should know that. But and he won 60 years later. But
yeah.
At the very last board meeting of National Review, and this topic is about future of conservatism, and one of the things Bill had said at that meeting, and you wouldn't know about it reading Sam Tannenhaus's book because he didn't cover the last 10 years of Bill's life, but Bill was emphatic about that the future of conservatism must include the fight against Islam, what he called Islamofascism. And I'd like to know what the panel might think about that not too well-known Buckley mandate for conservatism.
Well, all right. Yeah, I mean, we're sort of thinking about fusionism and some of the old categories of how we think about the conservative world, conservative view of the world, and didn't talk about foreign policy at all. Look, I think there's a real question about whether Western Christian civilization is compatible with Arab Islamic civilization. And I think we should be direct about that. It's because, of course, there are exceptions, right? I think actually America has done a better job of assimilating our Muslim immigrants than Europe has. And there may be some demographic differences there. I remember I had a regular Muslim cab driver when I lived in McLean, Virginia for 10 years. He took me to the airport and all the rest, who was the chair of Muslims for Romney in 2012. Right? Oh, and it was on the issue, the main issue for him was same-sex marriage. Right? So somebody this morning maybe it was Mike McConnell. I think, Mike, you made a sort of reference to this possibility. So, by the way, it connects to the previous question to talk about. I mean, obviously immigration's been a big issue here, and I think one of the great talents of America forever has been assimilating immigrants from everywhere and making them Americans. National Review was one of the first to say, maybe we're not doing such a good job of that anymore, and maybe the scale of the people coming in are making that harder to do, right? They were saying it 25 years ago. The national question, as it was called then. Boy, John O'Sullivan and the rest of the editors then, Bill was still around then, were way ahead of the curve on that one. That is, I think, the large civilizational question for us in Europe, and I'll say one last outrageous thing. I think it's much worse in Europe than here by a lot. In fact, actually, there's one person in the new Reform Party in Britain who just last week said, I think we should figure out a means of stripping some recent immigrants of the citizenship they've been granted and deporting them from the country. Some voices in the French military have said similar things. Where's Caldwell when we need him? He's the one who's really all, Christopher Caldwell's all over the story. But that's going to be a really burning question for Europe in the next 10 years, I think.
The only thing I would add, Jack, is, as you know, even as Buckley was identifying jihadism as a core threat to the security of the United States, he was also increasingly skeptical of the intervention in Iraq. And so here I think is a measure of the anti-utopianism that Peter Berkowitz mentioned in today's morning panel that's integral to the conservative outlook. And that I find it amazing that we're still arguing over the Iraq War, but this is the case. I like to joke that, I spent the first half of my career arguing about Iraq and the latest half arguing over Trump. So really, I wish there was more to argue about. But I think one can be both serious about confronting Islamic radicalism and preventing it from killing innocent people, and also skeptical about regime change and nation building, which actually I'm hoping President Trump's advisors are reminding him as we continue our military buildup offshore of Venezuela. It's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, perhaps two more questions?
There are certain so-called national conservatives like Krista Muth and Vivek Ramaswamy that are seeming to attempt to reconcile nationalism and fusionism. And I wanted to hear, what do you make of this reconciliation? And do you think that this is the future of fusionism, sort of fusionism 2.0, mugged by reality?
I think it's tough to do that because, first of all, one of the things we're focused on and want to be constantly aware of is the emphasis on ideas. That's what not only fusionism's about, it's what, to a very large degree, Buckley was about and National Review's been about, but it's also what successful countries are about. If you're not committed to ideas and principles to a significant degree, the prospects are not good. And the other thing is, if you have good ideas, that is a way to inspire younger people. If you don't, you'll have the problem we had in the 20s and 30s when socialism was coming up and the kids were rebelling and the parents were saying, no, go away. This is all nonsense. Well, what do you think about? No, I'm not going to spend time talking about that. You lose. You've got to be strong on ideas. I think the problem, nationalism beyond a certain point interferes with some of the key bulwarks you need. It can interfere with freedom in certain ways, and it can interfere with, frankly, also a commitment to ideas. One other point I would make, and this also I think tends to be a problem that the conservative nationalism can have. I mentioned power briefly, and particularly for anybody younger who by any chance has not read Tolkien, I would strongly recommend they do, and the reason is very simple. He is the best I've ever seen at explaining the problems of power and how power works on human beings and how power will follow Lord Acton and corrupt. And what I want to hear from those who have ideas that are, of various kinds is how they are controlling power. That's what the founders of this country and the American Constitution did everything they could to control. And at the end of the day, if you don't control that to a significant degree, the outlook is not very good. If you do, the prospects are pretty good.
Maybe one final question.
Hi. So I was somewhat disappointed in your MAGA answer and what the future of that is. You have J.D. Vance, who's a Yale guy. I was surprised that name didn't come up. And, you know, Stephen, it seemed like you kind of crystallized what MAGA is about. The scale of illegal immigration, overregulation, too much spending, high inflation, too much green energy, all of that, that's what it is. Yeah. So, you know, I think J.D. Vance can take those ideas, move it forward in a way that Trump couldn't, in a way he can articulate it. But I would think he's the future. I just want to know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, just briefly, I mean, of course, but look, actually, I think the Republican bench is pretty deep. It's a lot stronger than the Democratic bench, I think, with a couple of strong Democratic prospects. I'll just say that usually 3 years out, the person you think is the front runner never gets the nomination in both parties. It seems to be the history of so who knows, maybe it'll happen again with JD. But more importantly is we know what they're against. Someone said this earlier, I think it was Mike. What are they for? How does this all work? And this goes back to the last question, which is a very interesting question about, because Chris is a good friend of mine to me. He was my old boss for 10 years, and they represent a competing strain inside the nationalist conservative camp between the people who want to use the levers of power to fiddle things around and redistribute, really, and the old-fashioned, let's get everything growing for everybody, which is kind of the old growth liberalism of Kennedy. And that debate is playing out and not always made explicit. So those will both play out, I think, in the future campaign, because I think there's going to be a room for a growth candidate in 2028.
I think you're seeing Vance try to balance the competing forces within MAGA. He's given speeches about AI and the importance of allowing AI to develop unhampered by government regulation, but of course he's also very forthright about his Catholicism, right? And so you can kind of see a sort of para-fusionism there with kind of technological dynamism, but also an attention to personal virtue and religious faith. I think that he's also trying to balance other elements in the coalition. He's trying to balance the Trump Republican Party, which is the main force, with the MAGA influencers and podcasters I was talking about. And there I think he's on shakier ground, quite frankly, and I think he's opening himself up to a potential primary challenge. Potentially, I know that he fears a primary challenge from the MAGA influencers, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Tulsi Gabbard, but he could easily draw one from Ted Cruz as well. Now, does that mean that he's going to not get the nomination in 2028? No. He's the incumbent vice president. He starts out as an incredible frontrunner. I think he's like 30 plus points up in the polls now. He's approaching 50%. But it means that the future, and this is why our answer was disappointing to you, the future is very cloudy in a way that echoes the future of the Republican Party and conservative movement at the end of the Reagan presidency, where George H.W. Bush was the front runner. Did he win the nomination? Yes, and he won the presidency. But he was challenged from the various voices within the Republican coalition that Reagan had assembled. We're in a similar place, I think, and we have a similar figure in Trump, who of course has that picture of Reagan looking over his shoulder in the Oval Office. But what we see as these coalitions develop is that once that formative leader goes, Trump will never really depart, but once he kind of moves to the side of the stage, the coalition becomes much less stable.
By the way, you know there's one Republican president conspicuously missing from the gallery put up in the Oval Office? Coolidge. For what it's worth. Well, okay.
Well,
Yeah,
I
I just
think-
heard the joke that when the writer Dorothy Parker was informed that Calvin Coolidge had died, she said, "How could they tell?"
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you all for what I think Mr. Trump would call a tremendous discussion.